Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The next session is about to begin.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lucia Rybnikárová and Vladislava Gubalova.
Good morning, my name is Vladislava Gubalova.
And I'm Lucia Rybnikárová, and we are research fellows at GLOBSEC Center for Global Europe.
In today's vulnerable and volatile times, it is about time for democracies to wake up and get back on track. And one of the important developments that comes with building resilient democratic societies and models is about inclusion of women in all areas, including politics and diplomacy.
All right, to make it more interactive, I would like to ask you to take out your phones because we'll be using Slido. And I already have a first question for you. And the first question is, do you agree with the following statement? Politics and diplomacy are dominated by males. Let's wait a second while you vote. Amazing! I can see we have a great audience today.
But maybe we should try to answer one more statement. Do you agree or disagree to the following statement? Women's equitable inclusion in politics and diplomacy is essential for peace, security, and prosperity. Okay, we couldn't agree more with you. And let us look maybe at two examples, Ukraine and Belarus. Maybe the statistics themselves don't show an equal representation of women and men in politics and diplomacy, but the job being done, the work being done even now by women in leadership in those two countries is already astonishing. So imagine if the equal representation is there.
Looking at the representation of women in Ukrainian parliament since 1992, we can see a slow but very positive evolution with 20% representation in the current Rada. Why is this important, especially now?
We all know that since 24th of February, women in politics in Ukraine have been tirelessly working in governing the country in war conditions. And not only that, but they have taken on themselves to pursue different diplomatic missions, to present a truthful and clear picture of what is the situation today in Ukraine. It is their work, it is their faces that we see around us, even here today at the forum. It is them sitting face to face with world leaders seeking peace and security for their country.
Likewise, women in Belarus are on the front lines pushing for change in the country. Decades of Lukashenko's autocratic rule had finally been legitimately challenged by 3 women, Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, Veronika Tsepkalo, and Maria Kolesnikova, simply calling for free and fair elections seeking reasonable reforms in Belarus. Although authorities have been discouraging women from participating in the country's political and public life for a long time, it was women who have become the drivers of protests in the fight for freedom, rights, and democracy.
Indeed, women's leadership is key for building resilient democratic societies for peace and conflict resolution. And here at GLOBSEC, one of our key initiatives is the CEEher initiative.
We aim to boost the voices of women in influential policy-making debates, in media, and other forms of public engagement. We also strive to contribute towards a change in narratives and policies which we believe can lead to more stable, secure, and prosperous place.
And we do this one way by having built a publicly available database for women experts in various areas, those that are coming from Central and Eastern Europe, Western Balkans, and Eastern neighborhood. If you're a woman in the audience and fit those criteria, we very much encourage you to sign up for database today.
We organize events linking key stakeholders, such as traditional CEEher breakfast that we just concluded this morning. We had an excellent exchange among influential women and men from the public and private sectors. And we proceed with powerful main stage panels as the one to follow. We organize support activities for aspiring young women, as well as we publish reports on different topics, as the latest one on women in Central European media.
And while we're talking about our reports, maybe we can feel the pulse again here in the room and see what are your perceptions when it comes to women in media.
All right, so I have another question for you. What is the percentage share of articles authored by women in Central European outlets? What do you think? I can see some answers coming now.
Other guests?
Come on. All right. I will share with you what our study has revealed. Only Slovakia made it above 50%, followed by Czech Republic and Poland that were very close to each other. And as we can see, unfortunately, Hungary is left behind with only 25% share of articles authored by women.
But let us try to answer one more question, and this comes to what do you think is the percentage of women sitting in top management positions in the same media outlets here in our region? Tricky question. More positive guests, maybe. Okay, wonderful. Let's see what our study has revealed in fact. So the numbers are not great. Only in the Czech Republic, through our studies, we have shown that about 1/3 of women are taken. 1/3 of the positions are taken by women. But if you looked at Slovakia, if you looked at Hungary, if you looked at Poland, the numbers are not encouraging.
We can all agree that there is a lot more to be done for the inclusion of women in all areas of life and leadership. But as empowering women is only one of the driving factors for building resilient societies, let us hear from our amazing panelists, female leaders, on other key values and strong democracy building measures. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please support our initiative. Thank you.
Hello, bonjour, ahoy. I'm Roger Hilton. A summer is incomplete without the GLOBSEC Bratislava Forum, and it's my pleasure to be reporting from the 17th edition of our flagship conference. We have a roster of all-star speakers and moderators, and I will be bringing you recaps, video highlights, and all of the developments from our international conference. Follow us on social media, and let's get started. As is tradition, we started early with our annual European Defence Roundtable, held on the GLOBSEC boat, and reviewed the outcomes of the Future Security and Defence Council that was launched last year. Moving to the Danube stage, GLOBSEC President Robert Váš delivered an official welcome and spoke about the importance to continue universal support of Ukraine and the need for unity. Slovakian President Zuzana Čaputová spoke of the need not to cape to bullies or intimidation and expressed hope for the next EU Council to formalize Ukraine's status. Addressing us live from Kiev, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stressed the strategic importance of the Danube region and the need to continue critical deliveries of humanitarian and military support, as well as the total need for Ukraine to defeat Russian aggression. Staying on the continent, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen reiterated the EU's position to hold Russia accountable for their aggression against Ukraine and pledged to help their country reach their European ambitions. In a one-on-one, Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic Integration of Ukraine, Ola Stefanishyna, declared Ukraine's intentions to be a competitive member of the EU and bring serious value to the European project. On the subject of the Digital Market Acts, EU Commissioner Margret Vestager stated the economic potential around the acts and the impending increased data protection for European citizens. On the issue of tech regulation, both Minister Fedorov of Ukraine and Deputy Slovak Prime Minister Rybnikárová shared the imperatives of regulating tech and creating robust cyber defenses. After a video message from Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba, his colleagues Minister Ivan Korczak of Slovakia and Aleksander Schallenberg of Austria discussed the impact of conflict on the regional geopolitics. The day ended with a Prime Minister's panel, where the leaders of Slovakia, Latvia, and Bulgaria stressed that we all live too long in our comfort zone, and that the situation today was a major wake-up call for Europe's eastern flank. That's a wrap for day one. For more information about the forum, visit us on our website, stay tuned to our social media, and see you on day two.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator of the session, Maithreyi Seetharaman.
Thank you all for being here today and taking part in a conversation that's going to be quite critical about democracies having woken up. It is time to get back on track. There's no better time to get back on track, actually, especially when the world wants to pull you off track. The brutality in Ukraine, President Lukashenko's acts in the past 2 years have truly revived the need for democracies in Europe to really clarify their positions. We have a redefinition of the geopolitical order that's going around, and also the fact that this is a moment that's ripe for autocracies to rise, even in democracies. We have political leadership that needs to see the light of day when it comes to trust, resilience with people. This is not the moment to become somebody we're not. So truly, how do we redefine who we are in democratic Europe or democracies anywhere on the planet, whether they be East, South, or anywhere else? So to discuss this, please welcome to our panel Kersti Kaljulaid, who is the Global Advocate of the UN Secretary General for Every Woman, Every Child at the United Nations, also the former President of Estonia. Also, Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, who is the leader of the Belarusian democratic movement, who is also joining us this morning. Ladies, there is no better time to talk about trust, to talk about building back better, but when it comes to resilience of our democratic principles, I want to start off with you, Sviatlana, and ask you, the last 2 years have been difficult as things have happened in Belarus. The last 4 months, even more so when it comes to the changing picture of people's attention and attention spans. Can you tell us what is going on in Belarus at this point with its people, with your movement, and also what is the message you want to loudly and clearly send to people who've gathered here at GLOBSEC?
Thank you, everyone. Madam President, I'm so glad to be here to spread the information about the situation in Belarus. First of all, I have to say that since 2020, we are fighting against dictatorship in our country. This is an extremely difficult fight because Lukashenko uses all his power to suppress people, to humiliate people, to make people flee the country because they are not convenient for the regime. And of course, when the war has started, we discovered our country a new reality as well, because accidentally Belarus became co-aggressor in the war against Ukraine. We could never imagine that our country would fight against Ukrainians, our brothers and sisters. But here we have to divide between regime who became collaborant and accomplice to Putin this war, and Belarusian people who, since the very first day of the war, started to fight on the side of Ukrainians. And the very first Sunday after the war has started, Belarusian people who were suppressed, thousands of people were put in prisons, went for a huge rally. 100,000 people went to the streets to show their attitude to the war. Thousands have been detained that day, but and people decided that open rallies are useless at the moment because rallies mean new political prisoners, new tortures, and tyranny. So people on the ground started to act undergroundly. And for 2 months of the war, 80 acts of sabotage on railways happened to stop Russian equipment, Russian troops going to Ukraine through our territory. Also, Belarusian people sent information to Ukrainian army about movement of Russian tanks, of launching missiles from our territory. So they informed Ukrainian army for them to be prepared for bombing. Also, Belarusian people who had to flee our country because of repression started to support Ukrainian refugees, because we understand how it is to leave your home, just grabbing your child and escaping the war. And also a lot of Belarusian men are fighting now in Ukrainian army. Belarusians organized their own Belarusian battalion by Kaljulaid, our national hero, and they helping Ukrainian army to fight with Russian aggression. So, and of course, on the international arena, we are lobbying for Ukrainian interests as well, because we understand that the fate of Ukraine and fate of Belarus are deeply interconnected. That it's very important for us Belarusians that Ukraine wins this war, because it also will give us Belarusians opportunity to once again try to get rid of the regime. Because when Ukraine wins, it means that Kremlin is weak, hence Lukashenko is weak, because Lukashenko is fully dependent on Putin, and we will have one more window of opportunities. But we are not just sitting and waiting. We are preparing our people enter different initiatives and organizations in new anti-war movement. So maybe the main messages I want to deliver today is that Belarusian regime and Belarusian people, two different things. And it's very important now to suppress regime as much as possible with political isolation, with economic isolations through sanctions, and to support people. It's so important to show Belarusians that they are not abandoned, to give us energy to continue our fight. So I ask you to support independent media, to support businesses who had to flee the country, to continue issuing visas to Belarusian people, for us to be sure that we have strong support, Western support, to continue our fight and finally win.
Thank you for that. President Kaljulaid, let's ask you, the picture has changed dramatically in since you were president and now you've gone into the United Nations, you're looking at things from a more global perspective. Paint us a picture of what kind of leadership we need right now to build back the trust, to allow people in Belarus or in other countries with autocratic regimes to remind them that the international community is there for them, and that wars like this are not the end of trust, but the building of trust.
Yes, indeed. I have my UN role of every woman, every child, but I also have the grassroots level view because I'm also on the Alta European Strategy Board, which means this is an organization actually which has been long time standing for Ukraine's place in Europe. So I have very different perspectives on the whole situation. And about trust, first I want to say I trust Belarus people. Whatever the opinion polls would show in Belarus, or for that matter also in Russia, I grew up in occupied Estonia. If they had called me and asked, what do you think of communist rule in Estonia, I would have told exactly what was need to be said. But I do not believe that the population of even Russia, let alone Belarus, fully supports this aggression. And this is precisely why autocratic regimes always end up the same way. Always. They never fail. It is because when they get economically mighty, they overextend. But there is another condition. They have to be able to suppress their people, because people never want destruction, and it always ends in destruction. For the aggressor normally itself as well, not only those they are aggressing to. This is something which we need to remember in this conflict. All aggressors, potential aggressors, all autocrats who might turn their economic might into geopolitical power are watching how this all will end. It's extremely important, therefore, not to lose also the trust of Ukrainian people, for example, or Belarus people, into the free world being able to stick together. And it really hurts this trust if you hear people saying like, well, there has to be some territory to be given for face saving, for example. I'm sorry, it's not territory. It's women raped, children, women, men killed, children deported. And it's always been this way. I had a very interesting discussion yesterday evening at the dinner, where somebody said, well, you Eastern Europeans feel so passionate about all. Must be that you are afraid for your own future. This is not true. We have absolute trust in NATO, because NATO has never failed in its role. But where we do not have trust is precisely this issue. We've seen it before. The whole Europe celebrated for half a century 8th of May as the day of peace and freedom. But Stalin was killing our people in the woods and in the farmhouses. Brezhnev kept more targeted killing, but it was still going on. I mean, even during the Gorbachev time, people were sent to prison if they, voiced their opinion too loudly. So it never ended. But it was, well, people choose to ignore it. And this is where we now need to build trust. We talk about our past experience, tell you honestly in the West why we are really worried that this might be repeated. It should never be repeated. And we actually have been very weak in putting our position because we've been polite for 30 years, because after all, we come from the weaker position. But frankly speaking, communist crime has never been treated similarly like Nazi crimes. Communist symbols have never been forbidden. And this was an error looking in the hindsight. So I really believe that we need also to build this current trust based on honest debate about what went wrong. I mean, the last time when free world and the autocratic world, well, had an iron curtain descending between these two. It's extremely important that we are honest, because without honesty, there cannot be trust.
Without honesty, there can't be trust, and the playbook seems to be on repeat on a constant basis, even in 2022. Just a reminder to our audience, please do let me know if you have questions, and when you do, please stand up, give us your name and your organization, and a very quick question. Keep it short, otherwise I will cut you off. We also have our online audience joining us. I can already see people sending lots and lots of questions in for you, so this conversation is going to be quite inclusive as far as possible. So let's get our first question from the gentleman at the back, if I can get a mic there. If you could just wait for the mic.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I think it's a very important meeting here. I'm Ferenc Mislivec from Hungary. I'm head of the new institute called Institute of Advanced Studies, GLOBSEC, which abbreviation is IASC. So before I ask, I would like to make a comment about democracy. We have to, I know it's not an academic lecture.
Very quick.
Democracy is in decay, in crisis for about 20 years after 9/11. And it's not very much considered in international public discussions. So we need to think about new forms and new contents of democracy. This is my remark. My question to Madame Tsikhanouskaya is, what are your hopes and expectations vis-à-vis the so-called European civil society? We used to be able to show a lot of solidarity in the 80s against the possibility of a nuclear war that united East and West. Again, I don't want to give a long lecture, but it was a miracle. It was a miraculous moment for years that we could cooperate, we could understand each other. Now it seems to me going this moment, but maybe Putin is going to help us and Lukashenko to bring it back. So what is your expectation vis-à-vis us? We forgot very, very quickly about Belarus after Ukraine came to scene. It seems to me it should be depressing.
Look, first of all, I don't think that Belarus is forgotten on the international arena and by civil society of different countries. Of course, I understand that focus now is shifted to Ukraine, and I fully support it, because the whole world now have to fight alongside Ukrainians. And we as Belarusians understand this attention to Ukraine, and we support it because, as I said, without free Ukraine, there will be no free Belarus. And Belarus is part of this crisis. We shouldn't forget that Belarus is part of the crisis, and this crisis should be solved in complex. You can't just solve Ukrainian problem and abandon Belarus to present Belarus as a bargaining chip, for example, because without free Belarus, there will be no safe Ukraine. There will be constant threats to our Western neighbors. So I see attention to Belarusian issue as well. Belarusian civil society is working very closely to international civil society. Our media is supported. Our different youth organizations, women organizations are collaborating with the same organizations on international arena. Of course, much more could be done. You know, you have to understand that this is our pain, this is our people suffering behind the bars, and repressions and tyranny is going on in Belarus. So find new ways how to communicate with the Belarusian people who are in exile and who are on the ground. It's very difficult to reach Belarusians on the ground with any kind of assistance, but we have to be creative at the moment and to find ways together how to be useful to each other.
How do you do that, Kersti? It's a very valid point that the distraction element is there. How do you get people in Belarus to stay focused on the agenda that is there for them right now? How do you build back trust in a government that is looking far away from them at this point when they're dealing with issues on the ground? How do you do that? How do you build that resilience?
First and foremost, I do trust into the resilience Belarus people have. The problem is, do we every day remember it? I mean, I'm sure they do have it because for 50 years, the Baltic states under occupation. I mean, we always remembered we were supposed to be part of the free world. And what we can do, we do. Support civil society, support Belarus business, and making sure that we do not feed the regime. This is very important, and it will remain very important. And it's all linked. The end of the war in Ukraine is all linked to what is also going to happen in Belarus. We very often say Ukrainians are fighting for the free world, indeed, and they are fighting for those nations who want the right to decide, which they have according to the Helsinki Final Act, but which Russian regime is violating daily. So this is all linked, and we have to keep in mind that Ukraine is fighting, first and foremost, for its ability to decide its own future, territorial integrity. But it is not fighting against autocrats per se, which means that one day when Ukrainian people, and I hope very much it will be their decision on their terms, decide to negotiate, then the ball is back in our court. And this is where now Western leaders need all the trust of their own people. I mean, right now it's easy for politicians. I mean, they see people dying in Ukraine, so it's easy to say air conditioning or peace. But once there is no fighting going on, will we have the smartness and the opportunity and the trust of our people to explain to them that all the economic sanctions need to remain in place until we can be sure that we are not rearming an aggressor? This is something which we need to achieve, and this is where we need the trust of our people in democracies. And I'm quite sure we can generate it only by absolute honesty. I cited Mario Draghi here, air conditioning or peace. This kind of honesty is needed from politicians. No, it's not going to be nice. It's not going to be comfortable. We are not able to tell you how long then these economic sanctions need to last. But we know that if we take them off, we have started a new cycle, the Georgian cycle, Crimean cycle, now the Ukrainian aggression cycle, big terms. We will only start the next cycle. Yep. Trust us on this, and please, I mean, explain to your people honestly what is at stake. It's uncomfortable. I think it's even economy will adjust in a couple of years. Yeah. It will be, the loss has been calculated if you do not trade at all with Russia in single digits. It's, I mean, comparable. You have to spend less probably on your defense, which is also unpopular in West. So economically, actually, it should probably balance. Yep. But the sheer uncomfort of living beside a regime which you have to sanction long term in order to not let it start a new war, this is uncomfortable. But it doesn't help pretending it is not there if it is there.
This brings up the question again of trust and resilience in people, and the question of how do you rebuild it. And there's a very interesting question that came in from one of the online audiences that seems to have disappeared from my screen, but I will bring it up for you anyway since it's committed to memory. That when you don't have trust, it allows the door to open for strongmen to come to democratic ballot boxes and sell a story that people fear, selling fear and getting strongmen to come into a democratic government. How do you counter that? When you talk about, Kersti, the issue of coming up with honesty, air conditioning or peace, or talking about the problems of, political prisoners and not being able to go onto the streets because you're making a choice at that point. How do you prevent that? How do you prevent strongmen in democratic ballot boxes? And how do you bring the honesty to the table and communicate to regular people?
You want to start, or?
Belarusian people live under dictatorship for 27 years. And for 27 years, they lost any trust to the dictator in Belarus. They understand that dictator with his cronies take care only about their own power. It's comfortable for them to have slaves as nation, and they conduct their conditions, and through these years, trust of people to each other arouse. And now people understand that they don't compete to each other. Our resistance is built on trust. We understand that people will help to each other, that no one will be abandoned. If, for example, a person is put in prison, this person in prison knows that people around will help to his or her family, that their children will not be abandoned. This is our reality, to understand that we are supporting each other. We are against a regime. So now I'm communicating to Belarusian people every day, though I'm in exile, but through different internet tools, I communicating with people. Yes, there is fear among the people, but this is what is important is that people every day, they overcome the fear and do small steps, to exhaust regime, to create multiple points of pressure on them. And everything is based on trust in the society.
Yeah, I would like to say that, democracy is like oxygen. You don't really appreciate it until there is lack of it. This is something which we have to always remember. But if you look around with open eyes, there are many a democratic nation who have a kind of illiberal tendencies. Politicians coming forward who openly question the, let's say, separation of power, independent institutions, rights of women, media freedom. There are many. And normally, this doesn't end negative in a negative way, because people think finally what they want, and they take responsibility in their hands, and they don't allow these kind of developments to happen. But there are other examples, and notably Russia. In 1991, when Soviet Union broke down, we never thought it will be like it was. For that matter, also we didn't think Belarus will be like it turned out. So people always, when given the chance to go and choose freely between the politicians who say, you will not have a worry in this life, I take care of everything, and politicians who say, I trust you to be grown-ups, take responsibility, and maybe also sometimes, recognize that, we have to take decisions which will not be suiting you most, but somebody else in the society, giving free choice, choose the other ones. Because those who will say, I will be your mother, father, and grandmother all in one, this is the danger, but it's so comfortable to think everything will be cared for. We are asking now every citizen of the free world, particularly in Europe, to take responsibility and accept that the next winter, energy-wise, is going to be very tough in Western Europe. There might be power shortages, there will be peak prices, but we have to be honest and say we do it because we stand up for Ukraine people, also for that matter, Belarus people, and for all people living under autocratic regimes. This is the test now of the will of the free democratic nations to prove to the world we have not gone too comfortable.
Do you think that Western leaders are being honest with their own people at this point when you talk to them? Honest enough, maybe, is the caveat.
I hope so. I hope so that now is the high time to be honest with the people, to explain that it's not Ukrainian war, but it's also a challenge for our countries as well, because all European countries also understand that there will be consequences for maybe their security, for their economy, because they are supporting Ukraine and Belarus at the moment. But I think that people will understand the politicians why they make this or that decisions, because it's very important for every one person to understand that it's not Ukrainian problems or Russian-Ukrainian problems. It is the problem of other countries. And when you say freedom is not given for granted, democracy is not given for granted, it shouldn't be just empty words for every person. And they have to support the politicians and diplomats in their decisions, because for sure governments in democratic countries, they want better for their countries, but they also understand their responsibility in front of the whole world, in front of democracy. So I'm sure that all the rallies, pro-Ukrainian rallies in different countries, they showed that people support decisions of their governments, and governments are honest in explaining what's going on.
How much more honest do you want them to get? It's like Kersti says, next winter's coming around, the bills are insane, cost of living crisis is biting, there are people choosing between food, heating their homes, even Ukraine feels like a distant problem at this point, let alone Belarus.
Yeah, politicians should be fully honest to understand what problems this or that country will have this winter, in a year, or which consequences can be for their country. So, the task of people to understand and to trust the decisions of the government.
I think there is a certain level of also economic honesty to be had. I hear in many countries, including my own, there is the debate, should we compensate from the budget the inflation? We all know it creates new inflation, yet we have this discussion. Our politicians are not so stupid that they don't understand it. I think it was Jean-Claude Juncker who was well known to having said that we all know what we need to do, we just don't know how to be re-elected thereafter. And at that time in the 90s, we had a generation of politicians who accepted their political suicide suicide for the reform. And I think this is now exactly this time for, well, politicians who are ready to risk their own political perspective to actually save the free world. And finally, I'm quite sure to encourage politicians. I mean, our people realize it, at least in Estonia, those politicians who did this kind of reform, normally they were re-elected 1 or 2 electoral cycles later. So finally, the outcome for democracy was good this way. So I would call all our politicians to be honest and brave, even if you see your own popularity ratings to go down. But of course, that also means that the political class in this sense has to stick together, that indeed we are left and right, we are dirigists, we are free market, but we are all for having to be able to have this debate and to test every 4 years at elections which ideas are more popular. This is our common platform, which we must never forget. I mean, coalitions, oppositions, I mean, different political flavors. But we all want to have this kind of a free and honest debate in our societies. And we should never forget that without that, there is not truly creative society, not truly creative economy. And I would like to take an issue which was said there, that democracies are in decline. I mean, I've been long waiting when this point will be proven. But I mean, China is not going to be a rich country. You know why? Because to have an economy which is extremely high productivity, you need creativity. But only free people are creative. If you try to be free and creative in China, I mean, things start happening to you. And that's why autocracies can become middle income, but they cannot rise from that rank economically. Leave aside all these kind of happiness issues and all this poorly economically, if you're not creative, you're not that productive. So finally, democracies will win, I am sure, but they need to be encouraged also not to have so low self-esteem, which we hear so often now.
A little cultural change among the political class. Never be afraid to lose an election. You might win it the next time around. That's a good tip. Questions from the audience? Yes, please. If we can get the mic.
I'm a journalist from Italy. I have a precise question for Mrs. Tsikhanouskaya on sanctions. Belarus has come heavily under sanctions, but do you think there is something else that the EU should do in terms of sanctions that it hasn't done, and maybe it has hampered the opportunity for regime change?
We are welcoming the strongest sanctions possible on Lukashenko's regime, because we understand that this economic pressure may be the only productive tool that European Union has, you know, to make regime change their behavior. So I have to say that the first sanctions, sectoral sanctions, strong sanctions on the Belarusian regime were imposed only in 10 months after our uprising, only after hijacking of Ryanair flight. Then was migration crisis, now participation of regime in the war. And I have to say that at the moment about 70% of all the Belarusian state export is under sanctions. So what is important now is to have a mechanism that follow the fulfillment of sanctions, because we are dealing with experienced regime that know how to circumvent the sanctions through Kazakhstan, Russia, and they open new organizations on their relatives that are not under sanctions. So there should be precise mechanisms that follow fulfillment. So maybe we are lack of this at the moment, and of course sanctions should be joined and fast. And for example, when after hijacking Ryanair flight, sanctions on potash have been imposed, but they left so many loopholes in the sanctions that export of potash was increased on 76% during 2021. And Lithuania itself, on national level, they closed this loophole. And I'm really grateful to the bravery of the government of Lithuania. So now maybe some more state banks should be under sanctions, Belarusian state banks. Some more state enterprises, but they are like minor ones. So almost everything is done, but to trace fulfillment of the sanctions is the crucial in this moment.
I think that brings up, sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think this is a more general point what you are making here. I mean, economies are live organisms. So they always adapt. It is positive. Our economic loss from not trading with Belarus is negligible. With Russia will be negligible in 2 years' time. But there is also a negative aspect to this kind of adaptations, is that the loopholes are always found. So indeed, in every country, you need constantly to seek through and see whether you have discovered a loophole, broadcast it, and then we need to constantly close it. So sanction packages need to change and adapt, which is certainly very important, thinking also Russia.
Closing off the loopholes is a critical question that also comes back from our audience, and this one's to you. What is your message, it seems, to those European leaders who prefer cheap Russian energy and appeasement over humanitarian consequences, the rights in Ukraine, but I also say Belarus?
Well, it's complicated question in that if you look at the energy market in Europe, then it is by definition a distorted market, because we have made green promises and we have tried to adapt our legal environment to that. And we've not been actually very clear to, understand, and the forward guidance has been short-term. The example, gas was not green, then gas is green, but only green for those who have a coal plant. They can demonstrate they are closing down. This is market distortion, which, is a political decision, but changes all the game. So it's fully understandable if now the big companies, and I've spoken to some all over Europe, are demanding that politicians put their money where their mouth is. So if they say, we don't want to use Russian oil and gas, then they really want to get a guarantee that people stick to their word. Yeah. And these guarantees are hard to come by because they cannot be national. So we had, for example, in Estonia, a case study where there is an LNG terminal brought in, which only 20% serves our own market, 80% a neighboring market. Which government then should be giving the guarantee? Therefore, we absolutely need to make sure that energy companies can trust politicians. And unfortunately, because of the energy market history in Europe today, this trust has to be also supported by the guarantees. Otherwise, we cannot do it. But we will do it. I'm sure we'll sort it.
It just needs, again, closing of the loopholes when you come to the new Green Deal and all of the investments.
Yeah, we need to get as quickly as possible to the point where the costs incurred to turn away from Russian energy are big enough to not to be acceptable as sunken cost going back. So basically, well, put it very simply, the cost has to be higher than depreciation of Nord Stream 1 and 2 to take together.
That is succinctly the answer to the question that everyone has on their mind and can walk away with. We have just a couple of minutes left, and a number of the questions from the audience have come for you regarding Belarus. And if I can just quick fire them to you. The first question is that your name has been added to the list of people suspected of terrorism in Belarus. Since that introduces the death penalty, do you think Lukashenko will proceed with eliminating his political rivals? That's the first question, if you want to answer that very quickly.
People are named as terrorists in Belarus just to threaten other people to stay calm, stay silent. In Belarus, it's now 60 terrorists, and this law about death penalty for attempted terrorism was imposed to kill political opponents. And it's very important, for example, to delete Belarusian regime from Interpol, for example, because they abuse this system. They put people on this list as terrorists, and people have problems while traveling. So it just was threatening, for scaring people, but of course it can have consequences, because there are a lot of people in Belarusian jails who are claimed as terrorists, and they could face this death penalty, and this question should be localized a lot.
Do you fear for your life?
I think that I stopped thinking about this because I'm in exile. I'm more or less in safety, but we have to think about people who are on the ground. We are afraid for their lives because they are in the hands of the regime, cruel regime.
In just a sentence or two, the key message you want to walk away with sending today to this room, to everyone watching, what do we do to ensure that we end any potential of having autocratic governments in our democracies moving towards the wrong direction. What is the last message you want to leave?
There was a question which was now taken away, which inspired me, and that was the question how much you can use violence in order to stand up against autocrats. I would like to, expand it. Yes, indeed. Democracies, because they do not cut corners and because they do not want to hurt people, they might seem slow to act, but finally, when the situation is dire, they do always react. And this is so important. But while we are talking about propaganda, anti-propaganda, also violence and the lack of violence, nobody questions the Ukrainians' right, for example, to fight for their freedom. But if we are not talking about the war situation, I think we should stick to the legal space, the rule of law, and also not to respond to propaganda with anti-propaganda. We shouldn't turn into the other side in order to seemingly quickly achieve our result, because this also finally kills the trust, because how would people know who is white and who is black if they use the same method? We should never use the same method. We should be proud we are democracies, that we negotiate with our people, we tell them the truth, we treat them as grown-up people. This is very important.
Grown-up people, that's how people have to be treated. One sentence, a message to GLOBSEC and to everyone attending.
Consistency is the key. When you have separate policy to separate country, so you have to stick to it. Because just maybe I will use a couple of more minutes. For example, now food security is discussed in the world. And this Ukrainian grain that has to be delivered to Africa, for example. And now regime blackmails European countries and the USA that we can deliver 10% only of this grain through Belarus, but you have to lift sanctions on potash. It's pure blackmailing. I'm sure that countries can find the way out of the situation, but lifting sanctions now devaluate everything that was made towards Belarusian regime. So keep your consistency, and only this will help us to get rid of the regime.
I apologize, I have to rush you towards the end of this conversation, but I'm being told that we are running far over our time. Thank you both very much for those insights. I hope the message has been heard loud and clear. Please give them a round of applause.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator of the session, Brian Whitmore.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the panel, The Fallen Villain, Russia After Putin. My name is Brian Whitmore. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and an assistant professor of practice at the University of Texas at Arlington. And with just a few words introducing this panel. On February 24th, a couple of thoughts entered my mind. I thought at the time, we're witnessing one of two things. Either we're witnessing the beginning of the end of a sovereign and independent Ukraine, which would be a tragedy, which would be a horrible thing, or we're witnessing the beginning of the end of the Putin period in Russia. That doesn't mean that we think that if Russia loses this war, that Putin's going to fall tomorrow. But what it does mean is we are probably moving into something I call late Putinism. Late Putinism can last a while, but it's a period where the regime has lost the initiative. It's lost its aura of invincibility, and it's lost its ability to set the agenda. So this is what I want to kind of just start us off with, with framing remarks for today's panel, and I want to introduce our panelists. First, there is Maria Snegovaya. Okay, Aleksander Kwaśniewski, the former president of the Republic of Poland. Bildt, the co-chair of the European Council on Foreign Relations and the former Prime Minister of Sweden. And last but not least, Rastislav Káčer, the former Slovak ambassador to the United States. Welcome, everybody. And I'm actually going to sit down now. So I wanted to get the ball rolling. I want to go one round of questions to everybody before putting it out to the audience for Q&A. Maria, you and I have been talking for years about something we both kind of refer to as the crisis of late Putinism. And this is this notion, not this belief that Putin's going to fall tomorrow. It's caricatured that way often. But this notion that the regime has lost the initiative. They're not setting the agenda anymore. They're losing the cities. They're losing the younger generation. You've been doing a lot of research into this in terms of public opinion, a lot of cutting edge research on this. And this was the case even before February 24th. Since February 24th, I was wondering how you look at this situation, this domestic situation in Russia, how the poor performance of the Russian armed forces in the war, and we both know that Russia does not treat leaders who lose wars well. It's still not clear that Russia is going to lose this war, but it certainly seems to be moving in that direction. How has this all affected the domestic political situation in Russia?
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Really honored to be here today. I think, unfortunately, in the European and Western takes on Russia's domestic dynamics, there is a little bit of over-optimism about how this whole situation is going to develop for Russia domestically. As a matter of fact, we, however, have seen a lot of the trends that had been unraveling before sort of solidify and consolidate as this war began, right? What are those trends? So first of all, yes, Putin has been losing support about more modernized groups within the Russian society. We are talking some business-related groups, the younger generations, right? But he is also using this current situation specifically to repress these very groups. The repressions in Russia have intensified, not significantly, not qualitatively different from what we've seen since mid-2020, but strong enough in combination with exodus of pro-modernization Russians from the country to unfortunately sort of consolidate the groups that are more reliant on Putin. The second element is information control. Unfortunately, right, the propaganda, the strength of propaganda is more deep and more powerful domestically than one would expect. Like Russia is really closely linked to Ukraine in terms even of parental links, right? There's a lot of connections. Yep. It's not like Russians lack information about what is going on. And yet, yeah, that they have access. Internet is 85% penetrated, and yet they actually are quite brainwashed by the current situation, strong enough at least to create support.
Can I interrupt you for a moment? Are they brainwashed or are they choosing to believe? Because this is the way I've always looked at it in Russia. You choose to believe things you know that they're not true.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it goes beyond just being brainwashed. It's just that the reality is too painful and too hurtful to recognize. We actually find that in the surveys, people's identity directly, it sort of censors the information they receive, right? The more a person think of him or herself as a patriot of Russia, the more he or she is likely to embrace the status narrative. Last but not the least, and I think it's really important in terms of sanctions, the Russian economy is more resilient and robust than it is believed. Again, if you live in Moscow these days, you hardly notice there is anything going on. Yes, there is inflation. Yes, there were some food shortages early on, but actually the macroeconomic team is in quite good control. And until now in Moscow, you can continue as before, unless we figure out a way here in the West to really impose serious sanctions, including the embargo, and particularly pushing the oil prices down. Russians are not really going to notice and suffer. And as long as you do not pay the price for what you're doing in Ukraine, you're not going to care, and you're not going to have incentives strong enough to revise your views. Therefore, I think the susceptibility, the vulnerability of the regime is strongly overestimated in the West.
So the short answer is that this has exacerbated these trends, but it's not reaching a breaking point.
Not at all.
Yet.
Yeah.
I want to turn to President Kwaśniewski now and talk about to explore the question of, does it really matter if Putin's there or not? Your country, of course, has a long history with Russia. You have dealt with Russian leaders. Does it matter whether Putin is the president or not, do we have in the West a Putin problem, or do we have a Russia problem? Do we have a problem that is much more systemic than one man?
Well, I think we have both. We have a Russian problem and we have Putin's problem. This is systemic because Russia is such a superpower with a lot of aggressive ideas, not during Putin's time. That is a long history of Russia, of Soviet Union before, and Tsarist Russia as well. And this idea of Great Russia, this is something what animated almost all leaders of this country from the very beginning. If you read the famous book of British historian Sir Buck Montefiore, Romanov's Dynasty, that you have explanation that this idea was fundamental idea of this state. So it's necessary to understand that that is part of Russian history and Russian understanding of own role and the world. Secondly, that is very much rooted in the mentality of Russians. So to count that after Putin will have some different leaders, that is a little bit naive, because even among young generation, this division between democracy and autocracy is more or less like among other generations. That is not so, it's better, with young generation is better, especially in big cities, I know, but still it's necessary to understand that is also mentality. That is this very special propaganda which would be unacceptable in other regions of the world, but is fully accepted or almost fully accepted in Russia. So that is a Russian problem. Russia has a problem how to change itself. I remember one of my conversation with Putin when we discussed the question of civil society. And he told me, no, Aleksander, that is impossible to create civil society here in Russia. I said, why? Because we have no tradition. I said, look, because if you will not start this process, you will have no tradition forever. You know, this is necessary to have this start point to do something. But that is such easy explanation why we cannot be democratic country, why we can have civil society, no tradition at all. What is true, but is also not willingness to start this process. And point number two, Putin. Putin, of course, is a big problem for this country. He created Putinism, which probably is nothing new as a political system in Russia. But of course, even when we accept that that's a systemic problem and some kind of new Putinism we'll have in the future as well, I think Putin missed or lost some chances to do some positive things because he didn't modernize the economy. Even in such system like today's Russia, it was possible. Maybe not in 100%, not to create market economy fully, etc., but to modernize economy, not to stay with all this traditional gas, oil in the industries, etc., was possible. It was also possible to start this process of civil society, especially looking for new generation, which is much more prepared to be part of such system even of communication between power and citizens. Third, of course, his biggest historical mistake, war against Ukraine. Because cynically speaking, if his idea was to have a control in Ukraine, existed a lot of methods to do a much softer way, not using this full-scale war, brutal war, aggression, killings, civilians, children, etc., etc. So it means that this systemic complicated Russia has a leader who is not interested to look for positive, good, better, promising or better for the future solutions, but he's using all arsenal, the worst arsenal from Russian history. That's my point.
No, and I'm reminded of the comments by Gleb Pavlovsky several years ago, who was part of Putin's original team before breaking with him. He said, when the Putin regime falls, it'll fall in one day and it'll be replaced by something exactly like it. Now, I think I would take a little bit of issue with that. I think we want to be very careful about falling into lazy determinism about this. I think we have to be really careful about making essentialist claims. But what I would say is that there's a default setting here. And that Russia's default setting tends to move in this authoritarian and imperialist direction. And it takes real, determined leadership to break it out of that. And what Putin is doing is quite the opposite. It is moving deeper into it. Prime Minister Bildt, I wanted to move to you because someday this war is going to end and someday Putin's going to be gone. They're not necessarily going to happen around the same time, although they might.
He might be immortal.
He might, well, this is, I'm going to get to this at the end. You're jumping ahead. I'm going to get to that at the end, sir. But what, from your perspective, what should be the preconditions for a return to business as usual with Russia, which people right now remarkably are beginning to argue for? But I'm talking down the road, post-Putin situation, what should be the preconditions for a return to business as usual with a post-Putin Russia?
I'm not quite certain what business as usual is. I've been around for some time also in Russia relationships, and it's been sort of ups and downs over the last 30 years. It's never been particularly normal. There have been good periods, has to be said, with impressive Russian leadership. I mean, I worked quite a lot with Boris Yeltsin and Andrei Kosyrev, and we had issues in the Baltic states and things like that, and it wasn't entirely easy, but it did work. There were a period in the beginning of the Putin period, we should not forget that, when he was also pursuing economic reforms. For the first 2-3 years, it wasn't that bad at all. It was rather good, as a matter of fact, from that point of view. Ups and downs. I would say that we will have normal relationship with Russia when Russia becomes a normal country. And what does that mean? It means that Russia decides, and that's not only Putin, that's Russia decides, that it's going to be a nation, not an empire. I think it is this imperial, call it nostalgia, call it impulse, call it drive, whatever you want. It is this that takes Russia into the one disaster after the other throughout history. If Russia could decide at some point in time and come to the conclusion that we're going to build a Russian national state, 140 million people, not that bad, 11 time zones, not that bad, so perfectly possible, and give up this ability or this tendency to try to go into war and try to go into sort of operations in order to control other territories, then we will, at some point in time, get what we call a normal whatever that is. Do we have a normal Poland? Do we have a normal Sweden? I don't know, but anyhow, I leave that.
No, sometimes more normal, sometimes less normal, but still normal. Still normal.
I leave that question. Then we can have a more normal relationship.
Yeah, because the reason this worries me is because I'm kind of obsessed with the mistakes that we all collectively made in the 1990s in dealing with post-Soviet Russia. We made the assumption that because communism had ended in the Soviet Union, that meant all the problems had ended and suddenly Russia was going to turn into a big Canada. We know that didn't happen. And I'm not saying that kind of... People actually said this to me in similar events to this in the early 90s. It's going to be like living next door to a big Canada. As somebody who comes from a country where we have the distinct pleasure and privilege of living next door to such a wonderful nation as Canada, this certainly was not the case, and Russia's neighbors can attest to that now. But I'm worried when Putin leaves the scene that we're going to have this, we're going to fall in love again. And we're going to move into this situation where we're going to be willing to overlook things, like we overlooked things in the early Yeltsin period, the intervention in the Georgian Civil War, the arming of extremists in Crimea, which was going on in the 1990s, the corruption. We ignored all these things. Ambassador Káčer, I wanted to turn to you with the exact same question I asked Prime Minister Bildt about this. What should be, and you could riff off of his answer as well, what should be the preconditions for a return to business as usual, and what is business as usual with Russia?
Brian, I'll catch on your point which you make, because I think it perfectly fits in this debate. In 2003, throughout all of the 90s, let's come a little bit back. In 94, I came to NATO, opening Slovak liaison office at NATO. And in this early 90s, we were concentrated not to confront Russia, but we were trying to do everything to pull in Russia. We were offering all kinds of a dialogue, all kind of a military cooperation. This was all mill-to-mill programs, pulling in the exercise, bringing in soldiers, building the confidence, catching the... Because we thought at the time that this is not Russia, which is a loser of the Cold War. It's not Russians. And before we were joining NATO in 2003, we were in the Courage NATO Council, and in one of the meetings, Tori Nuland was on my right hand as US representative, and she told me, you know, look what I recommend, go to Moscow and tell them that this is, you're not joining NATO because you're afraid, because you want to fence them off, you see them as the enemy. So I went, we got a lengthy debate with Sergei Prikhotko at the time, advisor to Putin, and I was trying to explain this precisely where you were hinting and said, well, you're not the enemy, we want to pull you in, you're the closest to us, if you look on a global scale, we share the set of challenges and risk and everything, we should be very close. He was looking at me like this was two planes which will never intersect. And at the end of the debate, he said, well, no, you know, look, it's very simple. You join NATO, you're our enemy, and our weapons will turn at you. This was the end of the debate. And then I asked him your question. I said, look, you know, could you explain to me? Because I think the Cold War was not a war of Russians and Americans. Russians haven't lost. This was the war of authoritarian, communist, unfunctional regime, and it lost for liberal democracy, for open trade economy, etc. And my impression was that you are part of the victorious side. And it was a grim face. He smiled, and he said, Mr. Secretary, you will never understand Russia. You are absolutely wrong. So I think this is the source of problem, and I want to go there. Here I would stop where Maria is hinting. We see the country, which is a systematic problem. This is not a problem of Putin. Everybody, you know, here would agree. This is not a problem of Putin. If Putin is gone because of cancer or whatever, because they don't treat those who lost the wars well, but we still will have ongoing problem and normal Russia as we were aiming. And normal, it's simple. I think normal is a relationship in which your partner doesn't want to bite you or have you for breakfast. Yeah. That's perfectly fine, you know, just to have a normal relationship. Coffee and the orange juice, and we don't need to love each other, but to have a predictable relationship on which I'm not waking up in the morning, am I going to be eaten or not?
But if I may add one word, because it's difficult, of course, to describe what means normal. But I mentioned this Sebag Montefiore book. That is a really great book. And my short comment to this book, it is the history, 300 years the history of Roman dynasty, is if some who in the world will tell you that Russia is European country, is not true. But if some who will tell you that Russia is Asian country, is not true as well. That is absolutely different entity. And I think politically we did a lot of mistakes because we try to understand Russia by analogy. That's because we react so that they will react so. And that is wrong.
Absolutely.
And that is wrong. And that is, of course, the problem for the future. Because in my opinion, this business as usual, to rebuild such kind of business as usual is impossible. That will never be again. Because we should leave as a West our naivety in our approach to Russia, and Russia must work for some elementary trust, which is necessary to have from Russian side. Because without trust, we cannot, make this business, not as usual, business, some kind of business.
Carl, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I mean, Russia is always going to be a fairly complicated issue for all sorts of historical and geographic and cultural or whatever reasons. I think we agree on that. That being said, there is also a Putin problem. I doubt, I mean, most of you would have seen, some of you perhaps several times, that famous National Security Council meeting on February 21st, when he was harassing and questioning the members of the National Security Council. It was difficult to detect any enthusiasm among any of them for starting a war. I think starting this particular war is a Putin decision. I doubt that any other of the guys that we saw on that particular video.
Except maybe Patrushev, but yeah.
Yeah, Patrushev, okay. I grant you Patrushev. But essentially, this was a Putin decision to start this war due to the fact that he's been sort of diving himself down into the history of Russia. He cares far more about the history than the future of the country. He's become obsessed with it. He has a particular vision, which he's explaining very, very carefully. I mean, listen to his speeches or read his speeches. He's very transparent. He's very transparent on what he wants to do. And it's a personal obsession. So, yes, there is a Russia issue that's going to be with us for a long time, but there is also a very specific issue. We have a Russia problem, you might say, but Russia has a problem with its own fate, destiny, future, whatever. But there's a specific Putin problem in launching this particular war, I would argue.
Before I go into the next round, Maria, did you have anything you want to say?
Yeah, I agree absolutely. And talking with that, the fact that definitely there's a Putin issue and there is a broader society or elites issue, the inability to constrain this leader who gets so much into his beliefs, right? There's elites who are unable to constrain him despite actually quite horrible consequences for them and the society that's also completely unable to constrain him. So in a lot of ways, it's a national failure. I would say this is the war that represents a national disaster for Russia due to inability to impose any institutional constraints on the leader's behavior.
Okay, I want to remind the audience that we'll be moving to question and answer very soon. So be thinking of your questions. You can either do this in the room. Please raise your hand, and the microphone will be handed to you, or via the GLOBSEC app, or online directly to Slido at #GLOBSEC2022MT. Before we do that, though, I just want to do a quick lightning round with everybody and just have a little fun here, because we all know sooner or later Putin's going to leave the scene, right? He's not immortal. He's not immortal. He's going to leave the scene, but we don't know how he's going to leave the scene. Is he going to have a peaceful retirement? Is he going to die in office? Is he going to be overthrown? We don't know this, of course. None of us know this, right? Obviously. But what do we think? What do we think? Because if you look at the history of Russia, you can count on one hand the amount of Russian leaders that have had a peaceful retirement, right? You can count it on one hand. I do this exercise with my students sometimes to kind of drive this point home. Maria, what do you think? How do you think Putin leaves the scene?
Well, a political scientist in me says that personalistic leaders of highly personalistic regimes of this type usually die in office, right? So he is likely unable to leave. Right, the question, what comes next? And we see that he is surrounded by quite hardcore hardliners, people. However, historically looking at the Russian history, usually after one hardline is gone, especially when sanctions that are in place are really hurting, you actually have another leader who wants some liberalization, right? So it's likely his regime, looking at the comparative cases of other personalistic regimes, is likely to be succeeded by another personalistic regime, but with more intentions to liberalize it or somehow improve relations with the West. Hopefully, I mean, of course, it's all conditional on a number of cases. This is where I think the West will get some leverage, and I think any liberalization, any improvement of relationship, right, should be highly conditional on concessions that Russian leadership will be willing to do. I wanted to quickly add one more point, right, on this whole Russia problem. Apart from everything else, and I just finished the study with my co-author, we actually analyzed how many of Putin's top 100 elite members have any links to Soviet nomenclatura. And we find that 30 years after transition, this number is 60%. So the problem, apart from all the other problems that you have correctly pointed out, is that Russian elites have never really left control after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was one of the smallest rotation of elites compared to every other country in the post-communist bloc. From that perspective, we should not probably be very surprised by what's going on. So of anything, right, we need really to push forward to achieve some sort of rotation of the elites when Putin is finally gone.
Aleksander, how do you think Putin leaves the scene?
Well, this is, of course, we don't know. In my opinion, if I see today three groups which can be the game changer of the situation. The first is not very likely is the street, let's say, the people disappointed because of economic situation, war, the coffins coming from the front, etc., decided to organize some actions against Putin. I think in my opinion, one of the reasons why Putin not decided for mobilization is that such general mobilization for the army in Moscow and at Petersburg could create some really protests from the side of young, well-educated people, and it could be some beginning of revolution, let's say. The second group are generals, especially when Putin decided to arrest and dismiss and not to kill still, but we'll see what will happen, generals. I think that is a group in danger, so that maybe they will decide to do something against Putin before they will be arrested, or dismissed. That's the second. Third, also not very likely scenario, the oligarchs, because the first group which really understand what means sanctions and they lost some parts of own fortunes are oligarchs. But I don't know how much these oligarchs, these oligarchs very close to Putin, surrounding him, are ready to be so brave, so courageous. So, and maybe the next possible scenario, very well known from Russian history and Soviet history, is some kind of coup d'état. So the group, let's say, this not existing Politburo, like in Khrushchev time, will decide, no, with Putin we cannot go forward, it's too dangerous, and it's necessary to make such fully controlled change on the top of the power. But frankly, and of course, we have a lot of this information about how much Putin is sick. But when I hear all this news about all this kind of sicknesses, I remind such good joke from Stalin's time, when every day the man is coming to the kiosk next to the Red Square, is asking for Pravda newspaper. And he's looking and giving back this Pravda, once, second time, 10th time. And finally the man in kiosk asks, comrade, you are taking this Pravda newspaper every day, and then you are giving me back this Pravda. What are you looking for? I'm looking for the necrologues. So, no, but the necrologues, comrade, the necrologues are in the middle of the newspaper. No, this one for I'm looking for will be on the front page. and it happened, this story with this kiosk and this man lasts quite a long time, unfortunately.
Carl, your thoughts?
Well, no one knows how he's going to leave. I think fairly obvious after February 24th is that he can't leave in a normal way. I think that's gone. So we have either the option that he dies in office, or we have sort of the February 1917 option, that suddenly the system, it was the army in that particular case, who said we can't really control the situation of the country if you don't do some sort of handover or whatever. I think those are the two options, and we haven't really got a clue. The dilemma is that there are no institutions. That was a problem to some extent in February 1917. If you go to the death of Stalin, if you go to sort of the replacement of Gorbachev, there were still institutions that could see me handle it. I think there is a fair amount of resentment and divisions among the wider elite. I agree with Aleksander that the oligarchs, as you see them in the Western media, is not necessarily that relevant. But there are lots of people who are rather angry at the people closest to Putin, who have got enormous fortune for doing nothing but being close to Putin. And I think those are the ones who are going to be in danger first. I think they will disappear somewhere fairly fast, and that will be done by others in the system. There is also, apart from the tradition that Aleksander mentioned, I think there is also in Russia sort of, I use the word liberal somewhat carefully, but there's a liberal technocratic tradition of the people who are actually running. This is a huge country. It requires technical expertise to run this huge country. And there are some competent people around in the system who are deeply frustrated, deeply angry, and perfectly happy to put the knife in the back of the people who have been just enriching themselves. So I would think that in the absence of institutions, when Putin leaves the one way or the other, it's going to be a very uncertain, possibly tumultuous, possibly even dangerous period until the system at some point in time stabilizes itself in one direction or the other. It's not going to be easy going. And this is, by the way, the awareness of this, and this awareness I think we picked up for quite some time in the sort of wider elite circles. This is the awareness that to some extent keeps Putin in power.
Right.
Because people don't, they think it's insane, this particular decision, they think it's very problematic, but they really fear what's going to happen.
No, I think, Carl, you hit it on the head here. I mean, this system hasn't been this centralized since Stalin. And for that reason, when Putin leaves the scene, that's going to be very destabilizing.
And even with Stalin, there was, on paper, a Politburo. They weren't too assertive, to put it mildly.
People are afraid of it's a choice between Putin and the unknown in chaos, and that makes it tough. Rastislav, last word to you before we, in the audience, should be thinking of questions. I got a couple I've picked out on the Slido here, so...
I'll be fast. This is monarchy reborn. This is even not a Stalinistic regime, so here. Usually there are three ways how people like him are gone. The first one, if you have some sanity, sense of responsibility, and honor of a flagship officer, At some point, you lock your office, you pull your gun, and you take responsibility for whatever you've done in your life. I don't know whether he got guts, an honor of a flag officer. I don't know. I doubt. Second way is what Aleksander, Karl say, you know, somebody will just kill you because you threaten their accumulated wealth and way of life. That's it. I would wish for the third one, which would be a nice precedence in Russian history. And the third scenario I would wish him a long and healthy life and a lot of time for reflection of his life caused by Hague or War Crime Tribunal. That, to me, would be a sign of change in Russia and good time for reflection.
From your lips to God's ears, Ambassador. All right, let's, any questions in the audience? And while you're thinking of them, I'll just ask one here to anybody that wants to tackle this. For any change in Russia to come about, the information bubble must be penetrated. How do we do that? Maria, that's something you've been thinking about a bit.
Can I quickly jump in there? I think a lot will depend on whether Russia loses this war, right? And I think a lot of great debate about discussions about this here, but nobody is very clear about what it means for Russia to lose this war, right? Because don't forget, right? Putin really controls the narratives in Russia domestically, and Russians forget quickly, always span of one day, what they've been told before. I would argue, even going back, even Ukraine is strong enough to push Russian soldiers to the borders as the war of February 24th does not constitute a loss for Putin. He will be able to sell it somehow to the population. Or only losing Donbass, I'd say, at the very least, not even thinking about Crimea, would seriously force Russia domestically to start some sort of internal debate, right? In other words, internalize the problems that Russia right now externalizes by pushing them on the other countries, right? But unfortunately, to do that, we need a much stronger commitment from the West. I will hope it will last and it will be stronger.
In penetrating this information bubble, it's crucial. My former colleagues at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty are doing their best to do that, but it's not easy in that information environment. I saw a couple of hands. Yeah, this gentleman here, and then to here. I don't know if. Yeah, so boom, 1, 2. Please state your name and please formulate it in the form of a question, please.
Thank you. I'm Michael.
Stand up, please, sir.
Yes, Brian, I will stand up.
I know your name, but everybody else doesn't.
I'm Michael Zantowski. I'm the executive director of the Václav Havel Library. And it would seem to me that Karl pointed at the key issue of whether Russia decides to behave like a normal nation or whether it follows its imperial drive or instinct or ambition or whatever. But it would seem to me that it has decided a long time ago. The Russia of 11 times zones is 3 times as large as the Russia of Ivan the Terrible or even Peter the Great. So it would seem to me that the problem is not for Russia to drop its imperial ambitions to behave like a normal country, but to force Russia to be a normal country to drop its imperial ambitions, because the problem is not just Ukraine, it's Georgia, it's Kazakhstan, it's Moldova, it's Belarus, and without Russia dropping those ambitions, it will never change. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, I think the core ambition, if you listen to Putin, is really the sort of the greatest Slav empire, so to say, the Tsarist vision. And the core of that is Ukraine and Belarus, no question about that. Then how far it extends in other directions, more difficult to have a view on, but that's the core. Then, of course, even such a greater Slav, Tsarist, 19th century empire would, of course, be an empire with a lot of other minorities. I mean, the problem of Caucasus ain't easy. There are issues in Central Asia that ain't easy by objective standards. Siberia is populated by small numbers, but large numbers of peoples with small numbers, each of them. So there will always be in this vast territory minority issues that are complicated. That's no way around that. But I think the core of the problem is the problem in Europe. Perhaps northern Kazakhstan will be an issue as we move along. But the core issue for him is Ukraine, it is Belarus, and what is beyond that is for Aleksander to judge.
Yeah.
Well, but shortly, I think the problem is the real problem is what Biden described correctly during his Warsaw speech, that is not only Russian war against Ukraine, that is also the conflict, the confrontation between democracy and autocracy. And if it's true, and I think it's true, we have in Russia autocracy, we have in other places like China as well autocracy, but history showed that normal element to protect autocracy is one day to open some war. So without war, without all these military methods, autocracy cannot exist.
This is the essence.
Yeah, this is the lesson. And of course, we hope that China is maybe different example. That China in this global era, having market economy, Communist Party as the only party, can be autocracy without such temptations for nationalism, etc. Now we see that. Again, China is very close to this nationalism, and if we will have a war on Taiwan, it means that autocracy cannot live without the war. That is a part of the story, and therefore we have to fight for democracy so much, because only democratic system can solve the problems of succession, of cohabitation, of cooperation, etc., etc. Autocracy is not prepared for that.
We hope that China is watching what's happening in Ukraine right now and being deterred and drawing lessons from it. I think we had a question over here.
Yes. I'm Federica, Sustainability Program Manager at GLOBSEC and Research Fellow at the University of Helsinki. I wanted to ask, well, whoever wants to answer, without going too far in time, the European Union will clearly have to reflect upon what it got wrong about Russia and its relations with Russia, because Russia will not vanish. It will be still the EU biggest neighbor. And we have some issues that we need to tackle together with Russia, such as climate change, being Russia the fourth biggest emitter of GHG emissions. So my question is, what in the short term, what are the options for the EU also to put a basis for a future in Russia which is not authoritarian? And you have sketched several scenarios on what could happen after Putin departure. Should the most disruptive scenario materialize, how could the EU support the country and avoid making mistakes as in the 90s, which are still very, like the memory of the 90s in the country is still alive, and everyone thinks about the 90s as a terrible period. Thanks.
Who wants to tackle that? And we have two other questions coming over here. If somebody could bring a microphone to these two gentlemen here with their hands up.
I mean, two quick comments. I don't think, this 1990s was a big mistake. It was a horrible collapse of the Soviet system with devastating consequence, where the entire economy collapsed with hyperinflation and all of those things. That was caused by the collapse of the Soviet system. I think you could say that I wouldn't say that we disregarded sort of the things that were happening, because they were nasty, the Chechen wars and whatever, but I think it was right of us to invest heavily in trying to build a relationship with this particular Russia. Not that we were 100% convinced it was going to work, but even if it was a 10% possibility of making a contribution to turning Russia in the good direction, that was worth doing. It didn't succeed, but it was certainly worth doing. Second comment is really about the future. I think we should be realistic enough and say that our possibilities of influencing where Russia goes is distinctly limited. What we can do is on the margins. That could be information space, that could be some other things, that could be an element of people-to-people contact, whatever is possible these days. Yeah. But it's going to be marginal. The future of Russia is going to be decided by Russia itself.
Of course, yes.
Absolutely. If I can very shortly, because I very much agree, we haven't done mistakes. We approached Russia with open heart, but truth is that in the early 90s, Europe, the West had to reconsolidate itself, enlarge what happened as a success story to Poland, Slovakia, other countries here. Well, so I really think that we haven't done too many mistakes. One thing what Europe should do today, first of all, we need to contain Russia and probably forget about some of the things, even the green things, for a while, because for what we need to be sure that we do not have a nuclear pollution coming out of this confrontation, and then we will keep the survival model of what we had. And the most what we can serve to future Russia is that Europe will stay strong, Europe will stay consolidated, Europe will integrate even more and will be even more efficient. I think this is the most what we can do. And then on top of that, what Karl was saying, I absolutely agree.
We have 8 minutes and 30 seconds to go. I want to ask these two gentlemen to bundle these questions together, keep it very brief, and then same to our panelists, because I promised the organizers I would finish on time. I keep my promises.
Very brief. Bart Kopt, Program Director of the World Security Forum. It seems to me that that we actually lost any hope in democratic change coming through the opposition in Russia. Because in all this discussion, we haven't even mentioned once Alexei Navalny, for example. So the question is whether we still possess, as the West, the possibility to influence Russia through the democratic opposition that is there, and what are the effective ways of doing that? Thank you.
And let's take the other question as well together, because we...
Samuel Abraham, academic from Bratislava. I'm a graduate of Soviet and East European studies from the 80s, and I hear lots of deja vu from my studies from the 80s, unfortunately. And the reason why that subject disappeared was not only fall of Soviet Union, but it utterly failed to predict what would happen with the Soviet Union. So the prediction is this totally useless exercise, unfortunately. What is important is to have lots of Macrons who will speak to Putin. It's lots of sanctions. And key to do homework. We can see what European Union did, fantastic. NATO did, fantastic. The third most important elephant in the room, which no one talks about and could be a topic for next year GLOBSEC, is to do with the offshore money. That's the whole thing. That's the homework for West, for itself, but also all those oligarchs, and including the stashed money of Putin. That's the key issue that's important. Open the offshore, close the Austrian, Dutch, Cayman Islands, where all that money is, and that's perhaps the better than predict his end, because he can take us with us.
Yeah. Okay, we got 5 minutes to wrap it up here. The questions are, does the West still have an ability to influence things in Russia? I think this one is tailor-made for you, Maria. The second is this issue of closing offshore, and I think, Karl, you probably have something to say about that. Go ahead, Maria.
Russia has a lot of heroic, really great, courageous men who've been fighting for Russia, including Alexei Navalny. Unfortunately, they're still a minority, and we've just seen how over the last couple of years, Putin regime just erased essentially the emerging Russian civil society, and unfortunately, the current situation is against us. Having said that, we definitely should continue the outreach, and especially, I think, engaging with the Russians outside who have the capacity to reach to the Russians domestically through the internet, through them directly, while imposing the economic pain on the society, so the society understands the consequences of the particular, perhaps pushing it to rethink some of the policy choices. I wouldn't keep my hopes too highly so far. I think that's the work that should be done, and I actually appreciate the effort on the Czech Republic, on Germany right now, that actually try to assist the opposition Russians in exile as we speak.
And the final question actually does touch on something that is near and dear to my own research, this idea that we in the West have facilitated this imperialistic, kleptocratic Russia by allowing and facilitating this corruption. In the sense, corruption is the new communism, as I like to say. Karl and Rastislav and Alexander, anybody want to quickly weigh in on this? We got 4 minutes and 53 seconds.
No, yeah, one point which is easily forgotten. We have, numbers are difficult, but I think we have in order of 400,000 Russians who have left since February 24th. And it's not primarily the oligarchs with a lot of money in the Cayman Islands. I mean, that's not particularly relevant. But there are artists, there are journalists, there are software engineers, and how we deal with them and give them possibilities. If there are, I think as someone said to me, there were 70,000 in Armenia. There are lots of them in Istanbul at the moment. There are lots of them in the EU that are on Schengen visas that expire soon. Will we send them back? Will we ask them to go for political asylum? They don't want to go to political asylum because they perhaps want to go back and forth in order to support an old mother that can't leave. And they are sort of a resource for the first. They are the talent of Russia to a large extent. So they are a resource for the future of Russia that is somewhat difficult to handle in this particular situation. And I don't think and our countries have, rightly so, we've been busy with other priorities. We haven't really come to grasp with that particular part of the challenge. And that particular part of the challenge is likely to grow in the years to come.
Last very briefly, you know, I think we were not that bad in predicting what is going to happen in particular now, Samuel, because there were many people, even in this GLOBSEC crowd, who they were labeled paranoics and nobody listened. So, well, we need to also those who predict rightfully, you know, to be listened to. But you're absolutely right. What we need to do is three things. One, it's to curb and cut down all the means by which Russia fuels political corruption in the West. And they've been extremely efficient to do that. And there were some of the means which you mentioned. I absolutely agree on that. Second, we need to do everything to cut down their means in very efficient infowar in hybrid operations here. We need stronger intelligence, more shared intelligence, more unity within the EU, and curb those activities down and take them truly as being hostile activities. And the third one, we need to be patient and brace for a long period for which no naivete has got a place. We are not going to change, as you say. Russia is going to stay there. And the Russian problem as a complex society, it's going to stay there for a while. We would need patience and we would need a firewall, how we would, first of all, defend ourselves and patiently work with Russian society as they are ready and as they are able to move on the way for normalcy, as it was already mentioned.
Well, please join me in thanking our panelists. They've really kept me on time here. Maria Snegovaya, Aleksander Kwaśniewski, Karl Bildt, and Rastislav Káčer. Please enjoy your lunch. I understand I'm the only thing standing between everybody and lunch. Please enjoy your lunch. Be back here at 1:40 for a session, Threat Detected, moving from cyber defense to offense. Everybody enjoy their lunch.